My name is Tanya, and I'll be moderating the session today and handling the Q&A session. Our speaker today is Dwayne Van Erd. Dwayne is an associate scientist at the Institute for Work and Health. He's involved in clinical work from 1990 to 2010 and has designed and implemented rehabilitation and ergonomic programs for injured workers. The focus of his research since 1997 has been on the prevention of work-related musculoskeletal disorders, and he is particularly interested in participatory approaches to hazard reduction in the workplace. And so I will hand it over to you now, Dwayne.
Thank you. Thanks for joining the webinar, everyone, and thank you to the CIPRD for hosting this. So, as it appears, I'm going to talk about participatory ergonomics today. I'm going to talk about it from a researcher perspective, but I hope and we'll try to focus on sharing practical information that could be used to apply in the implementation of participatory ergonomics in workplaces. That's the interest that I have in my research area as well. Donald Cole and Dr. Yvonne Stainstra are co-conspirators in getting some of these slides together, and there's people that I've been doing research with regarding participatory ergonomics. Carrie, Boyle, and Shannon also provided some slides for me. And I'd like to also just briefly thank all the IWH prevention review teams, because I'm going to be presenting some of the results of that work in this presentation. The funding sources, I have to mention funding support from the Ministry of Labour in Ontario, the Workers' Safety and Insurance Board in Ontario, and WorkSafe BC in British Columbia. The Institute for Work and Health operates with the support of the Province of Ontario, and the views expressed in this presentation are mine and do not necessarily reflect those of the Province of Ontario. So with that out of the way, what I'd like to talk about today then is I'm going to start with some definitions. First of all, with work-related musculoskeletal disorders. And the reason I'm starting with a definition of that is because there are strong participatory approaches, or participatory ergonomic approaches, are strongly linked with reducing the hazards related to the physical hazards related to work-related musculoskeletal disorders. So I'm going to start there, and throughout I'm going to present some examples that do touch on reducing those hazards. So I think we should all be on the same page about what those things are. I'll also present some definitions about participatory ergonomics, or definitions of participatory ergonomics. And the reason I do that is also so that we're on the same page. As you can imagine, any type of activity that's called participatory could have many different ways of going about doing it. So I'd like to provide at least a starting point for us all to move forward from. Then I'll talk about the effectiveness and cost effectiveness of PE programs from a research perspective. I'll try not to be too boring there. Touch then on the basic elements of successful PE, somewhat based on the evidence from both the scientific evidence literature as well as practical experiential evidence. And then we'll go on and talk a little bit about, or I'll present some examples from a participatory ergonomics project in the utility sector. So there's some really, I think, interesting things to show and share about how that project went, as well as the sustainability of that project. And then to wrap up, I'll try to talk about some things that are relatively new in participatory ergonomics. The role of participatory ergonomics in return to work, which not exactly new, but a little bit new. And then finally wrap up with a little bit of a presentation about participatory ergonomics as organizational change. And most of this stems from a recent research project that I've been involved in, so I can share some findings and some practical insights from that as well. So starting off then, the definition of work-related musculoskeletal disorders are, basically they are a group of painful disorders of muscles, tendons, and nerves. Some of the more common names for these disorders are carpal tunnel syndrome, tendinitis, tension neck, Low back pain is also a work-related musculoskeletal disorder. So I'm not going to make a distinction about whether these are caused by work or not. If one could imagine that even if they aren't caused by work, they are work relevant in that it's difficult to do your job well if you have pain, if you have a low back pain or neck pain, and that probably extends to just about every type of job that's available out there. So I'm not going to talk about etiology, just going to present this as a definition. And part of the reason I provide a definition and talk about it this way is because there are a myriad of names out there, right? There's repetitive strain injury, there's commuted trauma disorder, even new names being thought up now. In the Netherlands, the name is called CANS, C-A-N-S, complaints of the arm, neck, and shoulders. So I'm not sure that all these names are helpful, because that means I have to keep defining this every time I talk about it, but they are out there. They tend to mean the same thing. Sometimes people label everything as carpal tunnel syndrome, which is also not helpful, but at least it's a diagnosis. So we're talking about a group of painful disorders of the muscles, tendons, and nerves as we move forward in this presentation. So to provide a definition of participatory ergonomics, I think I have to start with a definition of ergonomics. And I've chosen this one from the International Ergonomics Association website. It's important to start with that definition because that's where participatory ergonomics starts from. And I think there's a couple things about this definition that are important. So if ergonomics is the scientific discipline concerned with understanding interactions among humans and a system, and is also the profession that applies the theory, principles, and data and methods to design that system to optimize human well-being and overall system performance. The key things about the definition then are that this is understanding the interactions between humans and a system, and that the outcomes are to optimize both human well-being and system performance. And often, I think, when people think about or talk about ergonomics, they talk about the health benefits, reducing hazards for musculoskeletal disorders, etc. And sometimes forget about the overall system performance, which is part of the definition. So the definitions that I tend to use when I talk about participatory ergonomics are both from 1997 and I think encompass the idea of what participatory ergonomics is very well. So the first one's from Wilson and Haynes. The involvement of people in planning and controlling a significant amount of their own work activities with the sufficient knowledge and power to influence both processes and outcomes in order to achieve desirable goals. So there's some vague words in here, but in fact, it's a very specific definition. The important parts of the definition are that you're involving people who know their own work activities and hopefully have enough knowledge and power to have influence in order to make change to the way they do their work or to the tools that they use. A much more succinct way to say that is practical ergonomics with the participation of the necessary actors in problem solving. A lovely, succinct way to say that, in fact. So the important thing there is the people that are involved, they should know their work, but also have some opportunity to make changes. So with those definitions in mind, I'll move on now to talk about some of the evidence from the scientific literature for effectiveness of participatory ergonomics programs. Just a very brief summary then. We found in a review that we started in 2006, this article that you see on slide 7 is published in 2008, in fact. Participatory ergonomic interventions can have a positive effect on musculoskeletal symptoms, reducing injuries and workers' compensation claims, and reducing lost days or sickness absence. So we found some evidence of that. More recent studies since 2008 have not shown quite as strong an evidence for these outcomes. Some well-designed studies, particularly from Scandinavian countries, have shown that there really wasn't a lot of impact from participatory interventions. Now, I say that because there is some mixed evidence out there, but we also need to think about the intensity of the intervention when we talk about evidence. So how well are these interventions put into place when they're studies? And what we found in the literature typically is that if there's a strong study design, a lot of times the intensity of the intervention suffers for it, and vice versa. Sometimes there's less strength in the study design when the intervention is implemented very, very well. So we need to keep both of those things in mind when we talk about the literature. There's also some evidence about the cost effectiveness of participatory ergonomics programs. My colleague Emil Tompa has led a few studies in this area, and he found that ergonomic programs are cost effective and tend to have the strongest evidence in the manufacturing sector. In one of the studies that Emil's led, he found a net benefit of almost $295,000 with a benefit ratio of 5.5 to 1. So to break that down a little bit, he found savings basically in the number of first aid only injuries. Also found savings by cutting the number of injuries that required modified duties, bringing down the number of absenteeism days, dropped the number of long-term sickness absences, and basically also increased the quality of production according to the number right first time in a weekly basis. So all of these things combined led to almost $300,000 worth of savings. And the study looked at a period of 4 years, I believe. So a pretty good indication of the cost effectiveness. Now, this is in the manufacturing sector. He's done some other studies that have shown that can affect other other sectors as well. So we've got some evidence that these PE programs work there and that they're cost effective. So they seem worth doing, but how do you, in fact, implement these programs? Typically, from practitioners as well as the scientific literature, these are the main features of the PE programs. First, you formulate a team. The team typically includes employees, supervisors or managers, ergonomists or some trainers, health and safety personnel, and very often research experts. Now, partly that comes from the fact that the scientific literature is part of the source for this, so there's always research teams involved when you're looking at the scientific literature. The team typically is then trained once they've come together by an expert, an ergonomist usually, to become familiar with ergonomics principles. Once the team is trained, they use that new knowledge to identify the hazards in their workplace and develop the solutions for those identified hazards. The important part about this is that the team works together to improve those workplace conditions through the participation and necessarily through communication and some sort of group problem-solving approach. So when workers do become involved in controlling their own work activities, as the definition that I used suggests, it typically also decreases hazards that may arise from work organization and some other psychosocial risk factors. People working together tend to have less stress in the workplace. They're working towards a common goal. So there's a lot of benefits that can be had from participatory ergonomic programs, both the reduction of the hazards that are targeted as well as the hazards that may surround that, if you will. There are a number of process plans out there. One of them is the ergonomic blueprint that Dr. Richard Wells and Donald Cole came up with. And if you look at the center part of the diagram on slide 11, you'll see essentially the same group of activities that I mentioned in the previous slide. If you start at the number 1 slide, identify opportunities for improvement, and then assess the hazards, and then you move through the steps 3, which is building the solutions. What's expanded in this particular diagram is the plan, do, check, act kind of approach, where you try something, implement it, see if it works, and then either adopt it or replan, rebuild, redevelop, and then try it again. That is one of the key features of participatory ergonomics, is the opportunity to try things out. What I like about Dr. Wells' ergonomic blueprint is that he's placed that ergonomics process within the broader health and safety process that goes on in any organization or workplace. And you may say that it doesn't always work in workplaces, but there's some aspect of health and safety that's going on in any workplace. And so he's trying to frame that within all of those other things that are going on in a workplace. So it's a very useful blueprint, although some people find it challenging to figure out at first. Once they get it, it works very well, I think. At least that's the reports I've been getting back from people. However, even though these tools exist, people don't always find them. So we were challenged to also review the literature a little bit more broadly and see what other kinds of tools and things were out there. So we did another systematic review based on stakeholder feedback that really wanted to know how can we best, what are the best practices, if you will, of implementing participatory ergonomics programs. So we looked at both the peer-reviewed literature, the scientific literature, as well as what's called the gray literature. And simply put, the gray literature is anything that isn't produced by commercial publishing. So we looked for documents that were basically on shelves and in workplaces, and as well as government documents or other health association documents, to see who's talked about how to best do this, implement in the process of participatory ergonomics. So with all of that information and data, we found that there were, or we summarized about 6 elements of a successful participatory ergonomic program implementation. So the keys that arrive from all of this evidence that we looked at is that you need management and employee support. You need sufficient resources committed to the program, and that means both the running of the program as well as the potential changes that are required. You need appropriate training, and that training has to be provided to a key number of people involved, the team, and sometimes a little bit beyond the team. The team, or participatory ergonomics team, sometimes called an ergonomic change team, must have the right people involved. They have to understand their responsibilities and work together in a consultative way to make the decisions. It's got to be a group decision process. That seems to be a key factor in a successful program. And that requires good communication between the team members, but also between the team and upper management, as well as between the team and individuals in the workplace. So you may have a wonderful collaborative ergonomic change team, but if the workers that they're interacting with are not trusting or not on board, not supporting the idea, then that may still be a barrier to a successful program implementation. And the last thing that was relatively unique from the literature is that there should be some training provided in how the organization works. In other words, basically, how do you go through the process of purchasing, or how do you go through the process of finding somebody who can help redevelop part of your programs? That's internal. And that was an important part of the success of a program, is knowing how to make things happen, or who to talk to make things happen within your organization. So with that review and those particular elements, we went on to develop Participatory Ergonomics Guide. And this guide, again, was based on the findings from the review. So we used evidence-based information, but we also added vignettes that were told to us by stakeholders who were implementing programs such as this in workplaces. So we tried to adhere to good knowledge translation principles, making a short guide that's easy to read and very applicable to practice. We see this as a companion guide, if you will, to the blueprint that I presented earlier, in that most of the things that we talk about here are about how to get started, how to initiate the program in a workplace. It's available on the IWH website, and it's been downloaded quite a number of times, so it seems to be a good starting point. It does not answer all the questions. It just gets you started. It seems to break down the barriers for how to get things started in a workplace. So we think that's been fairly successful and in trying to get the evidence from both practitioners and the literature into a single place, basically. So now I'm going to switch gears just a little bit and talk about a particular study that we did a number of years ago now in the utility sector in Ontario. And just to start with a couple of examples of what you might consider hazards. Sometimes hazards are relatively apparent, so working from heights or being reliant on other equipment. Sometimes it's apparent in the way that the environment is, with a door open or equipment leaning against a truck. Sometimes it's not apparent and a little more subtle in that it could be related to postures or interaction with others, and sometimes it can be very subtle, that small changes in tools or equipment could help alleviate some of the pressures or forces or other physical hazards that might arise from the equipment use. So this is all of these things are examples of the systems that humans need to interact with. So the participatory approach then, and some of the solutions that this team came up with over a number of years, I'll just present them now just as a way to show what kind of things can happen. So this is very specific, obviously, to the electrical utilities side of things, but I think these examples can be extended to other areas as well. So one of the things that they found, or actually the ergonomic change team found important to do, was to reduce the forces that were required to pull a certain length or amount of wire off for a day's work or for a job's work. And in the example in this picture in slide 16, there is a lot of force required to pull the wire through just because of the way it's being routed through the different slots, and then the angles and the way it has to be pulled. So that the team thought about this for quite some time and had to come up with and tried to come up with a solution how to reduce the forces. And they came up with this basically on slide 17. Their innovation was to create a mobile wire stand where the spools of wire are much easier or don't have as much resistance on the spindles, and where the wire passage is now a very wide area, so that can be pulled through very easily. But the interesting thing about it, and why the change team was so proud of it, is that they addressed a bunch of other issues at the same time. They made this portable, so it could be moved in different areas, which they felt was important for workflow within the room that they were using. But they realized it had to also be storable, so they have a retractable arm, something that can be folded down and put back into place. They recognized that if it was on wheels and you pulled it, it was going to be a problem, so the wheels lock. So that they were very innovative in covering off a lot of different concerns that they had about something that could cause musculoskeletal disorders. Some other solutions that came up during this project were much simpler, in fact. In one team, they decided to change the wooden handles of some of the tools that they were using with more shock-absorbing material. Composite materials tend to do that. So they moved forward relatively quickly with that. That was, again, a relatively inexpensive change as well. And one of my favorite stories from this study was the idea of cross-arm storage. And I had the pleasure of presenting this in the southern United States, where they kind of wondered what the problem was with all that white stuff. But cross-arms are used out in the field, and they are used to hold up wires when they're replacing poles and other wire hangers, I think. So but at the end of a job, they're often just thrown off the truck on the ground. And when they had to be used again for the next job, it was a challenge sometimes for the forklift driver to pick away at the ice and pull these out of there. A lot of back strain because the forklift couldn't do it all, so there was always somebody trying to pick them up. And the team took a while to come up with a solution, but they just came up with a simple stand. So they placed the stand in the same location in the yard that pile of crossarms might be, but now the forklift could drive up, pick up, put them on the truck, and the removal of the crossarms was also less time consuming because there was a spot for them. They could actually just put them on. So it's a very simple solution, but it took a change team to come together to figure that out. Other solutions, perhaps a little bit more innovative, was the design of tool supports. So tool support for a tool that would help cut down the hydro poles was an innovative design, and it was tested in the field so that the users could figure out that it was easy to use, it was easy to install quickly, so that it didn't take, the time to install it didn't take longer than the actual cutting job, which is often a barrier to people using tools. They won't often use them if it takes more time. So in this case, they tested that, showed how easy it was to put it on, how quick it was, and how easy it was then to do the job required with that tool as well. And the last thing about that particular project that I'd like to share with you is that there is some indication of program sustainability. So, and this is something that participatory ergonomics sometimes gets a bad name about, is that once the ergonomist has left the building, there's a suggestion that the programs fade away or sometimes stop immediately after the trainer or the ergonomist is gone. But this utilities project that I was speaking about, which we initiated, I think, in 2008, is still going today. There's a recent article in TD World, Transmission and Distribution World, that talks about this program, basically the program that the research started, which is still going today. And there's still some sharing of information across the different utilities by their ergonomic change teams. So it's possible to have a program, a participatory program, that is effective, cost-effective, and sustainable, and can continue on because workers will adopt this in a continual sort of plan, do, check, act approach. Okay, so switching gears again, I'd like to talk a little bit then about what we might think of as the future of PE or some different applications of participatory ergonomics. One in return to work, and then I'll talk a little bit about this idea of including it in organizational change. In return to work, this is not particularly new, but it's been around for a little while, but it's starting to come into its own, and there are research studies that I know of that are taking it beyond the traditional participatory approach. So it is something that I think is continuing and probably is a good future aspect of participatory approaches. The Sherbrooke model is the most, I would think, well-known of the participatory approaches. And in this model, essentially there's an occupational physician or attending physician or general physician, family physician that needs to work with an ergonomist assessment at a job site and then give appropriate recommendations for the return to work. In the study, that's how it was set up. The participating companies had a trained team that was ready to deal with return to work issues. The team included employees and management representatives. And the study showed that the workers that received the Sherbrooke intervention returned to work about 2 times faster than those compared to those that did not receive the participatory part of the intervention. And this was compared to simple sort of clinical interventions as well as like treatment as usual, which could be a number of different things that happened. The interesting thing about that study from Sherbrooke, Quebec was that it was replicated a number of times in the Netherlands with similar results. There was a very positive aspect to the return to work. To the return to work from the participatory approach. And Dr. Yvonne Steenstra, who's a colleague of mine at the Institute now, was involved in many of those studies in the Netherlands. So he's shared with me some of the interesting things that have happened in there. To implement participatory ergonomics in return to work, the key things that are required are proper support, which again, not dissimilar to the things that are required for participatory ergonomics in general. And the support needs to come from both management and workers, as I mentioned previously. Again, there can be resistance from either one of those sides. Resources have to be there, both for the time that it takes to do the evaluations, checking hazards, but also for the solutions that may arise. Communication is paramount. And there has to be some access to the workplace. And that happens, usually it's best if that happens early on, so before a worker returns to work. Sometimes that's just a matter of checking out the hazards. And sometimes it's just a matter of having that communications basically set up early. Within the teams that are set up for return to work, clearly defined responsibilities. There's an indication that prior approval for solutions, so those kinds of solutions that people know can be helpful, should be approved before they even get to the point of coming up with the particular hazards for some individuals. And then adherence to timelines is important in this because of the whole framework of disability management and return to work. One of the interesting things that Dr. Steens just shared with me is that in some of the replications in the Netherlands, they found, it wasn't statistically significant, but they found that the participatory approaches worked better with older workers than with younger workers. And there's some suggestion that that may be because they know their jobs better, maybe understand a bit better what it is about their work that was aggravating their injuries. So as we move towards an aging workforce, that might be an important part to keep in mind, that participatory approaches can be a very valuable way of moving forward, both with reducing hazardous workplaces, but also in the return to work process. Okay, and lastly, the thing I wanted to talk about was participatory approach to organizational change. And in this study, which was done in the last couple of years, we looked in the long-term care sector. So I'm trying to present some results from the different sectors that I've looked at. Long-term care is classified as high-hazard work, and typically the people who are doing most of the high-hazard work can be considered vulnerable workers. personal support workers are one category, tend to have lower education, sometimes English as a second language, and don't always have the opportunity to change things in their jobs. So we've been working very closely with the Public Services Health and Safety Association in Ontario, who developed a participatory approach, which we are calling an organizational change. So in this approach, which is nicknamed EPIC, which is the Employees Participating in Change program, what's unique about this approach is in slide 26, I'm showing the whole cycle, basically, starting at the top with pre-implementation process, management commitment, establishing program foundation, and at the bottom there I have program implementation. What I talked about before as the steps to a successful PE program basically fit in that bottom square, the program implementation square, and maybe extend over a little bit into the next one in program evaluation. What's unique about the EPIC program is this pre-implementation program and the emphasis on getting management commitment and having the organization ready to implement a change program, basically, or a participatory program. The pre-implementation process and establishing the program foundation are focused on getting an organization ready to do implementation. It doesn't work to try to implement things if an organization can't handle a new approach. So this is based on an internal responsibility system and the basics of health and safety, so having a good joint health and safety committee in place. So those foundation elements have to be there before you start thinking about program implementation. This also goes back to what I mentioned earlier about the intensity of the implementation or intensity of the program. If an organization is not ready or can't handle a new program, it would be difficult for them to fully implement a participatory approach. So then the program implementation, which I'll talk about in a moment, happens the other side of the circle there, where innovation and sustainability come into place, is that the program is already thinking about how to keep things going. And so they have a very nice setup in terms of the contact with the trainers and the ergonomists and how to move away from regular contact so that the organization can take on all of those things and keep it going so we can see a sustainable program happen. So we did a little bit of research in this area. The actual program implementation does not differ greatly from what I mentioned before. You start with selecting a champion and then format the team. So you have a steering committee team as well as a change team. That's not all that different from what I mentioned before, because most of the time the two different parts of a change team might function that way. Then you go on to do the training and coaching, both from the point of view of the ergonomist training, the hazard identification and developing solutions, but also training how to do things within an organization. And then together with the pre-implementation things is you develop the management systems so that you can be accountable and support this change process through the entire organization. The interesting thing about this particular project is it was truly participatory. So some of the hazards that we note in the photographs on slide 28 are both slip, trips, and fall hazards, as well as hazards for musculoskeletal disorders. And the reason that both of those are highlighted in our photos is that the organization could choose which hazards they wish to address. So it's a truly participatory approach in the sense that they could choose the hazards that they may feel are most important for their organization or their facility or their location to address first. So here in these photos you can see that there are significant hazards. Hopefully you can see that there's a couple of instances of water on the floor, and then on the other side there's some bending issues carrying, pulling, dragging, and lifting stuff that could lead to musculoskeletal disorders. So as we moved through the program implementation, which was a big focus of our research, we found that the feedback from individuals was that there was strong staff buy-in. There was improved communication at all levels of the organization, and both the management and the employees considered this to be a win-win program. So they were able to implement it and felt very strongly that it was a positive approach from the point of view of implementation. We noted from a research perspective that the change process varied across the different locations that this was implemented. And perhaps not surprisingly, that should be the case in a participatory approach because there's infinite number of ways to do things. The intervention process, feedback from the individuals was considered front-heavy, and much of that was due to the amount of training that was part of this program. So we're taking that into advisement and thinking about how that program could be changed to reduce the amount of front-heaviness. The overall awareness about the EPIC program in the individual facilities was very good. So people knew what was going on, even if they weren't in a department that was having change process going on. There was lots of awareness. And overall, there was improvements in working relationships. So some of the theoretical constructs that I threw out at the beginning and the things that were found in the literature we were finding in this particular research program, looking at a more organizational approach. So we looked at some of the changes as well, and I've on slide 30 I've thrown up the hazard identification cycle that the individuals at the workplace use to drive their approach, basically. So they went back to this cycle, and when we talked to them after the program had been implemented, they referred to this very specifically. So they talked about this concept, just to simplify it, of plan, do, check, act, basically. Some of the changes that came into place at the various facilities were things like having shorter garbage bin lids to reduce the impact on shoulders as you were trying to lift up heavy lids to dump in garbage. And that's compounded by, again, the Canadian winter component, where sometimes there's a lot of ice around those garbage bins, and so even to get a good footing hold to lift up the lids was difficult. There's quite the story with the garbage bin, and I'll tell you in a moment. There were changes in pill crushers, slip, trip, and fall changes that involved just taking care of the housekeeping, basically parking lot paving. There were also changes to dishwashing approaches with sink lifts. There were changes to feeding stools in dining rooms. Typically in dining rooms there were a few facilities that had wheels on the feeding stools so that they could move around to different clients quickly, but in fact they tried about 5 different types of wheels and ended up with no wheels because that reduced the hazard more effectively and didn't increase the burden of moving around. So that was an interesting story that we were told about how that process went. There were other more broad-ranging things like promotional campaigns and education sessions, changes to practices, sometimes very simple changes to with respect to equipment, like moving from the older style mops to more disposable style mops and things like that. Now, to come back to the garbage bin story, there was a very interesting way of going through this where the management and employees were working together to try to figure out solutions, and they tried a number of different solutions, getting in different companies to trial things. They tried plastic lids rather than metal lids. They tried shorter garbage bins, but the lids, in fact, for the shorter bins were even heavier than the ones that were taller. And it was usually because of the angle that was there. So they eventually tried out about 4 or 5 different options in mostly in the wintertime, because they tried putting steps beside the lids and evaluating all of these things, coming up with new ideas, because the things just weren't working. And eventually they changed over their whole garbage company to a different provider who provided a compactor where the chute, or the area to put the garbage in, was just lower because it was on the side. But the whole process was an organization-wide collaborative effort, with workers, putting in their input as to why this would work or why it wouldn't work, and management trying out different things. It really brought a lot of people together in that facility. So it was a very gratifying part of that program. All right, so I'm going to end on a high there with that piece of the program, and I'll just recap then. I think I've talked about some work-related musculoskeletal disorders definition, touched on the definition of participatory ergonomics, and then talked about the evidence, basically. So we touched on the evidence related to effectiveness, cost effectiveness, how to do participatory ergonomics, both from the evidence of practice as well as the evidence of the literature. Then went through some of the basic elements of a successful program. I talked about some examples from a research project that I'm familiar with. And then we touched on participatory ergonomics in return to work, as well as in an organizational change process, which we're continuing to work with and hopefully develop into a stronger and even more sustainable program. So with that, I'll wrap up. I'll say, please check out IWH for more evidence-based practice information. Follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and then I'll open it up for questions, and Tanya will take over, I guess, I hope.
Yes, I will. Thank you very much, Dwayne. That was a really great presentation. Let's see. We have one question. What's the best way to encourage employers to implement participatory ergonomics? Is the reducing MSD hazards in the workplace a good place to start? And do you have other resources that can be provided to employers?
I think the most often it has to be two-pronged approach. So certainly talking about the MSD and reducing the hazard or physical hazard side of things is important to mention, but very often it's also important to talk about the bottom line. So there's a savings in costs that comes with addressing the physical hazard. So in Emil's study, he showed that there were decreases in the costs of first aid, sickness absence, and those things. I think the other side of it that should always be mentioned is there's always the idea or the possibility of increasing the productivity of an individual, and this can be in any sector, basically. So I think both of those things should go hand in hand. I have some colleagues as ergonomists who would suggest that you only mention the productivity side of things to start with, and then come back to the health side of things. But I think together those are the things to work with. As far as tools or resources, beyond the PE guide that we developed, there's not a lot out there. I think there are other organizations that have similar guides. I've come across in the gray literature some what are called white papers that show some of the economic benefits of ergonomic interventions. But it comes down to, if you're a practitioner, your own experience, the evidence that you've gained over time, and I think emphasizing the cost savings both from the injury prevention side as well as the production side.
All right, and then there were two different I guess, sectors that people have asked about as far as participatory ergonomics, and that would be construction and retail, that you didn't
All
talk
right.
very much about, and curious what types of, like, does participatory ergonomics affect those?
hmm So from construction point of view, there's a group of researchers from the U.S. University of Washington in St. Louis, Anne-Marie Dale, and she's done some very innovative work, and also in Boston, I think, where they've adapted the participatory approach to the smaller teams. So in one section, they were looking at flooring, floor layers, and engaging those groups of people to learn about the hazards and change things about their own job, and that's really key in construction, because construction crews may change over time. So you might be in a bigger crew on one project, and then only some people move to another project, or you might be only with a crew for a day. So having the individual opportunity to control your hazards was really important. So she's done some very good research in that area, and it does seem to work. The challenges of doing the research are almost more of an issue than the actual challenges of keeping the participatory approaches going, because once the individuals learn about it, they do let me close that. They do continue on with it, and it does get sustainable. In the retail sector, I'm not aware of as much research in that area, but I do know that there have been in Scandinavia, there's been some studies that have looked at participatory approaches in more of the, I would say, the retail sector. So it's possible, again, because participatory ergonomics is so adaptable, it's possible to adapt it to whatever environment. The challenges, I think, are when there's small groups, or when groups move, or when they're not all in one place at any given time. And so in the literature, you see a lot more office-based or manufacturing-based studies, because it's just easier to have big groups of people stay where they're and work in the same place. It doesn't mean it's not doable in other. So I'm now keying on the challenge of doing the research more than actually doing the participatory approaches. They're out there. We know a little bit less about them, but they are out there, and it does seem to work. I hope that answers the question.
I had come up was around new technology and handheld computers, or I mean handheld devices, and whether that is something that you've seen addressed in examples with the participatory ergonomics.
That's a great question. I haven't seen it studied as, let's say, mobile or tablet tool use. I haven't seen it approached as hazards. I have seen approaches where mobile devices are used as data collection for studies. And I think increasingly in some businesses, some sectors, handheld devices are used more and more in the workplace or in the field, if you will, as well. So there has been some, I don't know how participatory approaches, but there have been approaches about how to best mount mobile devices in vehicles for those industries where people are out on calls and then have to come back to their truck either to enter billing information or data or things like that. I think that's on the wane because people are carrying things with them a lot more. So I think we're starting to see some of that come into the literature, but it's nothing that I've seen that shows, or sorry, that has really examined those things as hazards that could be addressed with participatory approaches, at least not yet.
All right, and then there was another question from someone from more of an employee perspective of if you're approaching a potential employer or you're working for an employer and you have some physical limitations about addressing and bringing up these types of issues?
Oh, from the point of view of
Of
just raising them?
yeah, and like ways of, I guess, using participatory ergonomics types of thinking as an employee instead of as an employer.
Right. Yeah, we in the PE guide, some of the early study, we actually tried to reach employees in a survey, and we did fairly well, and it seems that they are useful. So one thing to do is to find a resource like the PE guide or something that you could bring with you to your employer or to your joint health and safety committee. So it's usually a tool or sometimes it's a website, but you use the leverage of finding something external to your workplace that you can use to say, is this an idea that we could move forward? I think if you're advocating for yourself, that you should approach as many different people in the organization. You need probably, well, you don't need, it would be helpful to have as many champions as possible to help make changes. From an accommodation point of view, there's also the legal side of things that should be on your side. So if you're dealing with a disability, then that's also another way to leverage change. I think if you're open to a participatory approach, then I think the idea would be to propose it as a group of people working on the problem, and if it has impact larger than yourself, then that's another way to get traction. So if it impacts more individuals, then that's another way to get traction. I've seen some participatory action research, some employees or workers who've led projects that are participatory in nature, so I know that they exist, but I haven't personally been involved in that particular type of research.
All right, and then on kind of a little bit of a similar vein, is a self-assessment tool for office employees been deemed an effective tool, especially in measuring their own setup before and after doing their workstation adjustments?
Yeah, that's a great question. It does not seem that there is any agreement about any particular office ergonomics assessment tool at this point. There's been lots of attempts, and I know I've have colleagues who've been involved in some of those attempts as well to try to come up with one way of doing it. But so far that seems elusive. So I don't think there's one approach. I think there are certain, they're being developed all the time as far as I can tell. I think there's a relatively new approach that's now developed as an app. So I think they're out there. It would be nice if there was agreement and that we could all begin to use a similar or very same tool to do that. But at this point, to my knowledge, that does not yet exist. So there's a lot of different ways to do it, which means there's a lot of different opinions and a lot of different issues with the measurement of an office setup.
Okay. And then one last question. Someone asked if there have been systematic reviews that address gender differences in PE program implementation and outcomes, particularly in healthcare occupations.
That's a great question. No, not that I'm aware of. It's sometimes difficult to look at even individual studies to know whether they've done anything in terms of a gendered analysis, but the reviews that I'm aware of have not necessarily picked up on looking at the differences in gender. Certainly healthcare has a predominance of females, so that there's certainly some benefit to doing that probably, but and certainly there might be in other occupations as well. I know there are individual studies that have looked at some gender differences, and some researchers, Catherine Lapel in Canada, I think, has done some interesting research in that area. But I'm not aware of a systematic review or a review of literature broadly that looks at the broader picture of that.
All right, very good. I think we're going to go ahead and end there. Dwayne, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really interesting, and we had really great interaction on it. So thank you very much for that.
Great, thank you.